Hi, welcome to part one of our media notes. So this will be all about media and media as a linkage institution. So first we need to go over the fact that media is oftentimes referred to as the fourth estate. So their job is to communicate information and bring awareness to things that the government is doing, but also to bring awareness and information to the government on what the people want government to focus on. All right, so in media, a free press is a foundation requirement for a democracy. All right, so let's talk about the roles of media. There are three of them. You have the gatekeeper, or also known as the agenda setter. So they are going to report on issues and policy and events, and that's going to that's going to bring awareness to events. But if they choose not to focus on something, that is also agenda setting, because then the people aren't paying attention or aware of that issue. So that's what we mean about agenda setting. They are going to set what the people are paying attention to, or what government is paying attention to. They're controlling a narrative, and that is not necessarily a bad thing. Where it gets a little tricky is when we get into the more cable news programs, in which they are looking at trying to make a profit as well. Another role of the media is as a talent scout. They are looking for talent, possible future stars of various political parties, and highlighting them, starting to research them, giving people background knowledge. They also are a watchdog. This is their investigative journalism side of the media. They are going to be reporting on activities of the party in power, and the positive and negative things that they are doing. Typically, they're going to do a spotlight on the negative things that the party is doing, but they're going to do investigative journalism. They're going to dig deep. You won't find some of that investigative journalism, say, on cable news networks, but you'll find it in newspapers a lot of times, in magazines. It's still alive and well there. And then once it's reported there, then you see it in cable news, in which they're reporting their findings. And then finally, this is scorekeeper. It's also called horse race journalism, meaning who's ahead. So you can see it both ways: horse race journalism or scorekeeper. Who is ahead in the polls? Who is leading? It's not about policy when they're doing the scorekeeper. It is about who's in the lead. And so people are more concerned with, is my candidate that I'm supporting in the lead, or are they not, versus what are the policies? How do the policies, match up with my beliefs? There's horse race journalism. All right. Now, history of media, kind of how it developed. First and foremost, they start with newspapers. That's from the get-go. There were people, it gets reported. Some newspapers were daily, but some people didn't get the newspaper but once a week. Excuse me. People who tend to read newspapers, even in the 1800s, but it's true today. Individuals who read newspapers even today in 2020 tend to be more informed and more involved in politics. It's because the newspapers, they can print more. They have more room. They're not tied to a time limit. They're tied maybe to a word count or a column space. But if it's an important issue, they can add more column space if they need to. Unlike with TV, they're restricted. So they can get the whole story. They can give both sides. They can express the opinions. We then developed radio, and so radio became easier, more convenient. You could flip on the radio and listen as you did things around the house. Radio became very important for fireside chats with FDR. to convey information. People would schedule events to listen to the radio, at certain times because they're going to get the news. So we start getting a set time of news reports, essentially. Then we develop television, and this kind of changes media again, because now it's not just the information you're conveying, but what you look like while you convey it. And so then we have this packaging that's starting to be created with television. You have the first televised debates with Nixon and JFK, there we go. And JFK on TV, everyone said JFK won the debates that watched it on TV because of image. And then finally, cable and satellite. So we, radio and television really brought news and media to the masses and brought it directly into the homes versus newspapers. A lot of people who couldn't read back in the 1800s, who were illiterate, they would have to go and have it read to them. Cable and satellite television, this is another change in that media history. They change the viewing habits. No longer do I need to have to tune in at 5:30 for national news and 6 p.m. for my local news, but I can tune in and get the news anytime I want because it's cable. But it also changes that there is now channels that start to be created around a point of view or ideology. This then leads to the internet, which means that now I don't even have to be at home to get information. I just can have it on the go, especially with our smartphones. And I readily can find information even easier. But it also means that if I am not using proper critical thinking skills, I can come across a lot of information that is not accurate. And finally, you have media consolidation. We are starting to see from the 80s, in which we had like 50 different media companies, and this was started in, the 1930s, having a wide variety, that one single newspaper or media source could not have too much of the market share, to today in 2020 that we're down to 6 main media companies. And it's around money now, the limited choice of options. Here is a political cartoon from a couple of years ago when AT&T first mentioned or first proposed buying Time Warner and all that it included, which was HBO, Warner Brothers, TBS, and CNN. In 2018, that merger was approved, and we now have AT&T. Not only do they control a lot of media sources, but they also control internet, and they have dish and cable. So it's consolidating, and there's the concern that the more you consolidate it, the less choice people have, and so they lose some, there's less freedom per se. Okay, now let's look at the First Amendment and government regulations. So the First Amendment obviously is 5 major freedoms in it, 2 of those being freedom of speech, freedom of press. And government regulations is how government does do some regulations on those freedom of that First Amendment right. So let's talk about First Amendment. So when we talk media, this is freedom of speech and freedom of press. And there are there are constraints on that, and there are issues that limit what the media can do. So let's talk about those a little bit. So there's a couple of relevant case laws here. First off, you have Neer versus Minnesota. This establishes what's called prior restraint. So prior restraint, in this case, in Neer versus Minnesota, the state of Minnesota tried to prevent a newspaper printed by a gentleman named Neer from printing, and it was printing articles that were very critical of the Minnesota state government, and they tried to prevent those articles from being printed. And Neer sued, saying that his, freedom of speech and press were violated. And the Supreme Court ruled in this case in 1931 that the government cannot use prior restraint. They cannot, essentially says, the government can't come into a newspaper or a media source and say, I'm sorry, you can't print that prior to them printing it, cannot limit that printing. They have to allow the press to print those things and, put those out there into the world. And if something is a violation, say they print classified information, then they can be punished post release, but the government cannot come in and say, nope, you can't do that. That is Neer versus Minnesota. That is still in effect today. The government cannot restrict that. Then you have the New York Times Company versus the United States Pentagon Papers. This is, very famous case in which the Pentagon Papers were leaked to various newspapers. There's actually a movie about this called The Post. And once again, this is prior restraint on this case as well, because the United States government was trying to, and the Nixon administration on this one, was trying to stop the New York Times Company, the New York Times, from printing documents that showed that why we were in Vietnam was not the reason that the American public had been told. These had been released and handed over to several newspapers, Washington Post being one of them, and the United States government had gotten an injunction to prevent their publication. The New York Times then gets them and they start to print them. They get an injunction not to allow them to print them until it gets to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court says, nope, that's prior restraint. You cannot prevent them from printing the material. No matter how bad it makes the United States government look, you can't. This is also when the trust in our government started to go down. The FCC, this is the Federal Communication Commission, okay? So it's a commission, means it's an independent regulatory agency. This is something we will talk about more in depth in the bureaucracy unit, but the FCC is the ones who are going to put regulations on media, and there are some regulations that they put out there. But know that they're an independent regulatory agency, meaning that they are independent of the president. There's not a lot of oversight or influence from the president or the executive branch on this agency, but they do put some limits. They have the equal time rule, or they used to have an equal time rule, and they actually, not used to, they do have an equal time rule that if the various TV stations, cable networks, media source grant or sell ad time to a candidate, they have to give equal ad time to the other candidate. So it's the equal time rule. If they interview one candidate, they have to offer to interview the other candidate in office. So, equal time rule. The Fairness Doctrine is a doctrine that is no longer in place, which said that any media source would have to give both sides of the issue. They could not just do one side of the issue. They had to present both sides of the issue. The concern we got, it was eliminated in the 80s under Reagan, because the concern was that it would be declared unconstitutional as a violation of freedom of speech for media sources. It never went to court, so it's not certain. Reagan is, well known for not, wanting that rule and wanting less regulations on a lot of areas. Deregulation was kind of a Reagan thing. So, it's not there anymore. There are some people who say we should, but it's also why you have an MSNBC and you have a Fox News, that they don't present both sides of the argument all the time because they don't have to. A couple of things I forgot to mention, especially on relevant case law, but also in the First Amendment, you have freedom of speech and you have freedom of press. That's slander and libel. So I do want to talk about these here because it's covered under the First Amendment. So Slander is spoken word. So it's when a spoken word is said that is going to damage a person's reputation. Libel is written word. And so anytime it's written, and it doesn't have to be in a newspaper, it can be on a social media post, for a non-journalist. It's for anybody who says something or writes something that it damages, knowingly says something false that damages another person's reputation. But slander and libel for public figures like politicians, celebrities, those sorts of things, athletes, are different, are higher, because they are public figures, and so the fact that they'll be attacked is kind of a given, unfortunately, in our world. And so the proof of slander that they knowingly were doing it to try to damage the reputation is a higher bar than for a regular everyday person. And this wraps up the first video over media. We will, as soon as you get done, make sure you rewatch this if you need to, and then start part 2.